Hello, everyone. Hello. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may be located in this world. Welcome to another episode, another live stream on the Left Lens. Of course, as you can see, I am very happy to be joined by Brian Berletic of the New Atlas. Before we get to you, Brian, though, I just want to give a little bit of some information to those who are viewing this stream. So the best way to undermine the censorship that happens on platforms like these is to be sure to like the stream. Make sure that you're hitting that thumbs up because that helps boost this stream in the algorithm. You can also be sure to get notifications by hitting the notifications bell and subscribing to this channel. And honestly, the best way to get notifications and to know when I'm live, to know what work that I'm coming out with for free is to subscribe on Telegram, to follow me on Telegram, t.me / Danny Dhaiphong. You can also subscribe for free on Substack, and you can find that link in the description. And of course, in the description, you can find all the places to support the Left Lens, Patreon being the best place, patreon.com / Danny Dhaiphong. Find all those links there to help financially support this work and to help keep it going. And thanks to everyone, YouTube members, Patreon members, and all the subscribers that have been helping contribute to this work. You are all appreciated. Today, actually, I'm going to be introducing a new feature. I have one question from Patreon subscribers to our special guest here, and I'm also going to open it up for super chat questions as well. And for those who subscribe on YouTube, you can also ask a question as well, and we will try to get it to as many as we can. This will be an ongoing feature, and Brian will, of course, be back on again. But Brian, you are here. Thanks so much for taking time out of your late evening in Bangkok. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Yes, it is 11:30 p.m. Just in case anyone is wondering, but it's always great to be on. I hope you and your audience are doing well, and I look forward to the discussion.
Yes. Well, thanks so much for being up late with me. It's always a challenge, the Asia time zone to the Eastern time zone, and someone pays, that for sure. And I appreciate you taking the time out when it's convenient. So let's get right to it, though, because it's been a busy 2023 already. And I had to get you on here because it's just been a lot of information. So there has been obviously a huge push by NATO, by the U.S.-led NATO alliance, to fortify, to militarize, to provide whatever they can to Ukraine in order to turn the tide, they say. So I wanted to get your take, and maybe you could also provide an overview of what's actually happened thus far. There seems to be a lot of different kinds of information about what weapons have been actually sent to Ukraine, what's been promised versus what has been already sent into motion. And we have the Defense Contact Group, which includes Jens Stoltenberg, NATO secretary. It includes Mr. Reznikov, the defense minister of Ukraine, and of course, basically all of the NATO so-called allies. And they're discussing, especially these Leopard 2 tanks, whether Germany will allow the green light for not just NATO allies to provide them to Ukraine, but for them to dip into their own. What exactly is happening here, and will it turn the tide? Is NATO going to be able to turn the tide in Ukraine, given that it seems like the battlefield situation has either been stagnant or in Russia's favor for quite some time now?
Well, I mean, it is very hard to tell because when, say, the most recent U.S. Military aid package to Ukraine, when they announced this, there are things that they can send immediately and that Ukraine can start using immediately, like 155 millimeter artillery ammunition. But then they have things like these Stryker armored personnel carriers. The Stryker armored vehicle, it's a wheeled armored vehicle. I'm sure people are familiar with them if they were following the U.S. Occupation of Iraq. They used those quite extensively there. And there's many variants, but the variant they decided to send to Ukraine is just, it has a 50 caliber machine gun on it, and it drives around on the battlefield. It has light armor, and it's vulnerable to pretty much everything except small arms fire, which, I mean, the type of weaponry that Russia is going to be firing at these on the battlefield is going to be much more significant than small arms fire. So what it is a system that Ukraine has not used yet. and then they're going to have to learn how to use it, how to maintain it, how to sustain it on the battlefield. It is serving the role as armored personnel carrier, along with all of these other types of equipment that the U.S. and its allies have sent. They have sent the M113. There was like a Dutch variant of that. They've got British and other European armored personnel carriers. They're all different. They have different engines, different transmissions, different wheels, different types of track systems. It is such a hodgepodge of equipment, probably dozens, if not scores, of vehicles serving the armored personnel carrier role alone. And then how do we figure out when that's actually going to get to Ukraine? We have no idea, because they have to train Ukrainians on how to use it before they send it. So this is what makes it so hard to keep track of these announcements. And like you said, recently, since the new year, they have been announcing larger and larger quantities of weapons. And what it looks like they're trying to do is just throw weapons at the problem. The problem is Ukraine is losing huge amounts of men and equipment on the battlefield every single day. Their offensives ground to a halt. They threw a huge amount of men and equipment at Russian defenses, and they ground to a halt. And they're back to where they started before the offensives, which was falling back, losing a city here, losing a city there. I think a lot of people are looking at the situation around Bakhmut. I was just reading a BBC article where they admit that Ukraine now has announced that it has lost Solidar, but they're going to do a counterattack and take it back soon. So just wait. But they also admit that Bakhmut is at risk of being encircled, and you can look at even the pro-Ukrainian life maps that indicate that that is the case. So how is that happening? I thought HIMARS, M777, all of these weapon systems, I thought that turned the tide. I thought the Javelin and the Stinger missiles, they turned the tide. So how is it that we're right back to where we started again? And now they're going to throw more weapons at the problem. And Danny, I'm sure you were following the proxy war in Syria. This is exactly what they did there. They just threw weapons. They had all these training programs inside Syria, outside Syria. And then it eventually crept toward U.S. military intervention directly. That's what I'm afraid is going to happen regarding Ukraine. It's incredibly dangerous. It was incredibly dangerous in Syria. Russia and Syria and Iran and Hezbollah, they managed that escalation very well. But in Ukraine, it's a different matter, because this is just the Russian military itself in Ukraine. There are no proxies for the West to fight with or through if they decide to intervene directly. So I hope that's a good overview. I could get into the details of the different weapon packages, and I could talk about all of the problems of the Leopards. It just depends on what you want to know.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the Leopard 2 tanks, especially, you hear Ukrainian officials over and over and over again say, tanks, give us tanks. Like, we need the tanks. And they're even saying now, I think it was Zelensky who said about Ramstein, this defense contact, the air base that they're meeting in Germany. He said, let this be the meeting of tanks that leads to then the meeting of F-16s and then the meeting of long-range missiles, right? Basically what he's saying is, let this be the moment where Ukraine gets everything it wants and thus allowing it to win this conflict. Is there any realistic basis to that? Like, could that ever be a possibility? Because it just seems like every time NATO throws weapons at Ukraine since February of last year, it's led to some progress. Like you mentioned Kherson in your videos and Kharkov, but then as you said just now, they threw everything at those battles, and it didn't really change the overall direction of this war. So do you feel like the same thing, this is going to happen again if Ukraine gets these weapons? Like, will it actually, if let's say they get everything they want after this meeting, these tanks, would it change the outcome of this conflict, or change at least the direction of it?
No, it's just going to drag it out longer, get more people on both sides killed, more thoroughly destroy Ukraine. The problem is, even if NATO were to fight Russia directly, Western military analysts recognize that Russia has a very formidable anti-access area denial capability. They have a premier integrated air defense system. They have all of these long-range missiles and rocket systems, guided, unguided, multiple launch rocket systems, and they have a huge amount of artillery. So this allows them to create a layered defense that is extremely difficult for even NATO to punch through. And that the whole concept of modern warfare is, it's not just about single weapon systems on the battlefield, is how they all operate together, and not just the combat side of it, but also the logistics and the sustainment side of everything. Your ability to continuously send ammunition, fuel, spare parts out to the field, your ability to bring vehicles in from the field, repair them, and send them back as quickly as possible. Whichever side can organize and coordinate all of these different moving pieces the best, they are the ones who are going to win. And Ukraine cannot do that with equipment they've never touched before, that they're just going to get a crash course on and try to use. And if we want an example of Ukraine incorporating military equipment, foreign military equipment properly, and it's still not making any difference, just look at the Bayraktar TB2 drone. They made the deal with Turkey years ago, and then over the last couple of years, they had Turkey come in and train Ukrainians. They test flew them. They established the infrastructure they needed to support them in Ukraine. And this happened over the course of several years. And then when the Russian special military operation began, they started shooting them out of the sky, and they had to keep asking Turkey to send more until they stopped. I haven't heard anything about the Bayraktar TB2 in a long time. Have you, Danny?
No, no, not at all. Not at all.
And so that is an example of, and the TB2 is not a bad weapon system. It's just not capable of doing what they wanted it to do, which was take out Russian forces that are protected by a world-class integrated air defense system. And so that doesn't matter what else you send to Ukraine. You send tanks. Tanks are supposed to go into battle supported by aircraft, both helicopters and warplanes, supported by a significant amount of artillery and infantry, with infantry fighting vehicles on the battlefield. And these are all supposed to be forces that are well-trained, crews with years of experience operating these vehicles, not just individually, but collectively in their unit. There's absolutely no way for Ukraine to do that. It's impossible. And it was exactly like the US and their allies thinking they're going to create an army out of thin air in Jordan, in Turkey, and send them into Syria and defeat the combined forces of the Syrian Arab Army, the Russian Federation, Iran, and Hezbollah. It just was unrealistic. And look at how it's unraveling. And we're looking at the exact same situation in Ukraine right now. It doesn't matter what they send. It's not plausible to send sophisticated, complex, modern weapons to a country in the middle of a war who has never used them before and expect them to use them effectively on the battlefield. It's impossible.
Yeah. I mean, Ukraine is, you say it over and over again, and I say it over and over again on this channel. Ukraine was a proxy. Ukraine was I don't think Ukraine was ever supposed to get into a conflict like this, but this is what happened. And now it seems like Ukraine, of course, is definitely paying the consequences. And this conflict has turned the tide in the other direction. It may not be, the kind of quick and resound kind of turn that I think people, especially who watch our channel, would hope for, right? It's not going to end anytime soon, given that these weapons only prolong the situation. But I was thinking about the situation in Bakhmut because I was watching your coverage and some others' coverage and looking at that map, that live Ukrainian army map. And it seems like Russia is in the process of encircling Bakhmut, and it could fall very soon. This is after the Solidar victory for Russia in recent weeks. What would be the significance of Bakhmut falling to Russia? Because I think what we see in the Western media often is not only are these weapons hyped as the potential for turning the tide, but then you also have a minimization of any progress that Russia makes on the battlefield, either through just omitting and playing down the situation, or when covering it, saying, well, this actually doesn't matter that much because we're going to we're going to make sure that Ukraine gets what it needs and that it will be able to wage some kind of offensive later this winter or the spring. What do you think would be the significance of Bakhmut falling to Russia? Seemingly, it seems it could be any moment now in the next several weeks.
Yes, I think people should keep in mind that Russia has said, and this is just what they're saying. They're saying that their primary objective is demilitarizing Ukraine. The commanders around Bakhmut on the Russian side, they have said that this is about drawing in Ukrainian forces and eliminating them. And they want to encircle Bakhmut, not necessarily to take the city, although, why not? But the idea of encircling the city is to trap as many forces inside as possible, to prevent them from withdrawing, and then to press them into positions that are less defendable, where they'll lose even more forces if they try to stand and fight. This is the whole process. And Russia has no problem moving the line of contact forward as long as they don't stretch it out longer. One of the benefits of leaving Kherson City and crossing the Dnieper River was they shortened the line of contact and they concentrated more forces along it, which gives them an advantage when you're trying to concentrate firepower and destroy as much of the enemy as possible. So this is the concept on the Russian side. On the Ukrainian side, Bakhmut, Solidar, Seversk to the north, and Avdiivka outside of Donetsk, all the way to the south of Bakhmut. If you look on a map, it is a line. It is a defensive line that Ukraine has built up over several years. These are defensive positions that you cannot just create overnight. They are time tested. They are battle tested. There was all of that fighting taking place, even if it was less intense, during the attempted implementation of the Minsk agreements. But they're not going to be able to fall back and build another defense line like that. So once Ukraine loses that defense line, which is why I suspect they're trying to hold. I mean, of course, there's the optics. They have to create the illusion that they're winning, so they don't want to just fall back. But at the same time, if they lose Bakhmut, Solidar, Seversk, Avdiivka, these are fortified cities that they're not going to be able to fall back to another city as fortified as these were. So that is the problem on the Ukrainian side. And then the other problem is we were told that they have HIMARS. Not even a single HIMARS launcher has been destroyed. This is what the Western media keeps saying, that Russia's making that up. And yet, if that is the case, and HIMARS was doing so much damage to Russia's rear, their supply lines were decimated, they had no ability to supply troops in the front lines. How is this happening? So this is the smoke screen of success that they've tried to create, blowing away in the winds of battle around Solidar and Bakhmut. Oh, Danny, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. I said, speaking of blowing away, we've had some tragedies for Ukraine that you've commented on, and I wanted to maybe flesh out the significance of these events. So you had just within the last several weeks, you had in the last week alone, you had Alexei Arestovich, the one of the top advisors for Zelensky, resign because of comments he made about a residential strike in Ukraine that was at first attributed to Russia, and then it seems like it was probably a mistake, one of the many that the Ukrainian military has made, trying to use these weapons that, as you say, they've never had before. And then you also had the who was it now? The
Minister of the Interior.
The Minister of the Interior. He died in a helicopter accident or whatever we may think happened to him. But this, these events aren't talked about very, I don't know. They get a singular report maybe in the Western media, and then that's it. But what do you think is the significance of these tragedies? What do they tell us about the character of this conflict right now? Because at times it feels like while Ukraine is getting all this money, getting all of these weapons, sometimes it feels like Ukraine's military and its government is like bumbling around, right? And has a lot of issues that are coming out into the forefront as it gets deeper and deeper into conflict with Russia, which is a much more stable, much bigger country, and doesn't have the same relationship, let's say, to NATO in the United States. It doesn't serve the same purpose. So what is the significance of these losses, of these seeming tragedies and huge shifts in Ukraine's political situation?
It's a good question. And the idea of Ukrainian leadership fumbling or bumbling while asking for these, increasingly huge amounts of increasingly sophisticated and complex weapons. It's a good question. Arestovich was such a visible figure throughout this entire, since late February. He was such a visible figure. He was the cornerstone of Ukraine's information war. And the fact that he's gone now, just think about, say, during World War II, when things were starting, Germany was under a lot of pressure, and they started cracking under the pressure. And things like that happened, where you had people who you could not possibly find someone better to do the job, but because they needed a scapegoat and because the wheels were just falling off, they threw them out the door. And so this is what it looks like happened with Arestovich. Who are they going to find who's more visible, who has more, I don't know if you would say he had charisma, but he had a following. Who are you going to find to fill that spot now? And what did he do? All he did was say what is the most obvious explanation for what happened. It was some sort of strike, some sort of weapon struck a residential building in Dnipro city, and it looked like another case of an errant Ukrainian air defense missile hitting it, or a Russian missile that was knocked off course by Ukraine's air defense system, which has had mounting problems. As you destroy radar sets and launchers, and the numbers get fewer and fewer, their capabilities diminish, and you get results like this. They killed 2 Polish civilians with an errant missile. So this is not something that is unheard of or unbelievable. The thing that's unbelievable is the story that Russia, for whatever reason, supposedly running out of cruise missiles, decided to just randomly hit a residential building in Dnipro city. Just makes absolutely no sense. So what Arestovich was trying to do was maintain some sort of credibility while moving the information war ahead, and they threw him out because of that. So that's one. You have the Minister of the Interior in a helicopter with his whole team. Why are you flying around in a helicopter in Ukraine in the middle of a war? Makes no sense. You have all of these people out there with Stinger missiles. You can't track where they all are, and you're flying around in a helicopter. I don't know. It doesn't make any sense to me. I have no idea why he was in the helicopter. I don't know any of the details about that, but he was, the Minister of the Interior in any country is a very key position. And to have him and his whole team disappear, that is a serious blow for Ukraine. Who's going to fill his shoes? I don't know. And the whole team, all the people around him, you'd have to imagine that at least some of these people were qualified for those positions. Maybe not. Who knows? But so you have these two incidents in the same week, as you pointed out. At the same time, the power grid is being chipped away at, and at the same time, Ukraine has lost one city, Soledar, and is about to lose another, Bakhmut, which They keep saying now that it looks like they're going to lose it, they say it's insignificant. Like you said, Danny, they diminish any advance by Russia. But just remember, not that long ago, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky visited, or allegedly visited, Bakhmut. So why would the president risk or pretend to risk visiting a frontline city if it had no significance? So it really seems like, we can all see that Ukraine is under tremendous pressure. It seems like things are starting to crack. That's what it seems like to me. And because things are starting to crack, what does the West do? They only have two options: to throw weapons at Ukraine, even things that are ridiculous, that make no sense, to make it seem like they tried everything they could before failure, or intervene themselves like they did in Syria. And this is where we're at, I think.
Yeah. And last night I covered, not 14 hours before we came on together, Brian, and people can catch that stream playback in on the channel. But I covered this story that the New York Times broke, where they said that the Biden administration and top military officials, Pentagon officials, are what they call warming to the possibility that they need to give Ukraine everything it needs to be able to strike Crimea and possibly take Crimea by military force. And, Crimea, as you've talked about, and as many may know who are viewing this, Crimea was what they call annexed, but it was really voted into through referendum in 2014-15, directly after this coup that the United States facilitated in Ukraine and in Crimea, with its long, centuries-long history of being very close to Russia. It decided it wanted to be part of the Russian Federation. And now, whatever people may think of that referendum, that's been the case. And the United States has actually been quite hesitant, especially since February 24, 2022, to talk about the United States helping Ukraine take this back. But that's changing. What do you make about this change, Brian? And why do you think that this is happening now? Because the way the New York Times reported it, well, they did the typical song and dance with the Center for Strategic International Studies and these think tanks and top military brass. Even at the end, they ended with a former, I think it was Philip Breedlove, former Obama top military official, saying it's ridiculous, it's insane to allow Crimea to be used as a Russia launching pad, as if to conclude, the United States really needs to get on this and really needs to make this war about Crimea. So what do you make of this, and why now?
Well, I think it comes down to they just want to destroy everything. If Crimea is sitting there, it's been mostly spared throughout all of this since 2014. Really, they want everything to be destroyed. They want to exact the heaviest price possible before everything collapses. That's I suspect, because taking Crimea, they like to compare Crimea to Kherson City, but there is no comparison. Kherson City, Russian forces were on the other side of the river. It was more difficult to supply them on that side of the river. It is a natural barrier that once you blow the bridges, you're not really going to cross it easily. Crimea is a different story. They act as if they cut the land bridge and they blow up the Crimean bridge, which, they haven't done that yet. It's still there. They act as if it's completely cut off, and that's not true. They have airports, they have seaports, and they could easily sustain military operations in Crimea. They're sustaining the Russian military operation in Syria using airports and seaports. So why couldn't they sustain the defense of Crimea in the same way? So it's not really the same. And I think it really is just punitive. That's what I think. I think it's punitive. I don't think there's any real prospect. Remember, before Russia withdrew from Kherson City, they were wiping out wave after wave of Ukrainian advances. That was all of those main battle tanks from the Eastern European NATO members. They had these Soviet-era main battle tanks that they sent to Ukraine, hundreds, and they just were wiping them out wave after wave. So imagine it's now Crimea on the line. I think the fighting will be a lot harder. There will be many more forces involved. We already see them preparing defense lines specifically to confound an armored assault. So I think it really is give them the weapons so that they can destroy things and make the people in Crimea pay. This is like what they're doing in Syria right now, denying the Syrian people food and energy just to ruin everything, just to spoil everything. And it's the same psychology, I think, at work regarding Crimea.
Yeah, which is interesting too, because that psychology has led, I mean, in Syria, right, there's constant reports coming out of Syria talking about the devastating impact of not just the 80% or so of its oil being looted by tankers, U.S. tankers, some of them Turkish tankers, although hopefully that will change in the coming months as they continue to negotiate. But there is this highway robbery of Syria's oil in northeast occupied Syria, and it's also the wheat, and it's also a lot of these resources, even water, right? These resources that are just being plundered and then taken to Iraq and then to wherever the United States wants them to go, and it's had a devastating impact on the Syrian people. And so, do you think Crimea? I mean, it seems like Crimea is a different situation in the sense that, unlike Syria, where the United States had already kind of destabilized that region and made it really difficult for Syria to, although it did with Russian help, make so many advances that it really did win that war. It's just now it's a proxy war that's endless. But do you feel like Crimea could fall to, like, if Ukraine were to get these weapons and the United States says green light, do whatever you wish, we're no longer going, we're going to look the other way at whatever you do. I mean, they've already done it, right? I think in Sevastopol there was a strike there. It wasn't, it was a terrorist attack. There was that bridge incident. We don't know who did that exactly, but it's likely has something to do with connections to Ukraine. And so there have been attacks, and even the New York Times said, well, we see that Russia's not going to conduct nuclear strikes because of this. They're not going to respond too hard, so it's okay. I mean, given that, you also have this dichotomy. I want to know what you think about this dichotomy. Even in this Times article, they said, well, the United States doesn't actually think Ukraine can take back Crimea militarily, no matter what, but it has to look like Ukraine can do it. What does that even mean? I mean, to me, it just seems it seems like any military conflict, any kind of struggle that happens that's an armed struggle, optics seem to be so low. I mean, for the United States, it seems to be so high in importance, but it seems like it's a very low priority if you actually want to win, right? I mean, am I nuts here to think that?
I think they are obsessed with optics to the point where it's undermining the reality of what they need to do to accomplish any of their objectives. But also, I mean, with Crimea, I really think they just want to hand these weapons over so that they could kill as many people as possible, cause as much damage as possible across Crimea, to make them pay a price, to destroy as much of it as possible, and to undermine the Russian government's position there in Moscow. I think this is all part of their strategy. They cannot take Crimea, but if they cause enough damage and they somehow demonstrate that, oh, look, Russia can't protect Crimea. People have to remember, too, before 2014, Crimea had its own parliament. I mean, it had special status. It was not just a part of Ukraine that Russia carved off. It had a special status because they realized that despite all of the Russian-speaking Ukrainians throughout the country, Crimea was especially Russian. And that's why it had special status. That's why there was a Russian military base there all of that time. That's why they had their own independent parliament. People have to keep that in mind. So this is, I think it really is, it's vindictive, it's punitive, and it's part of this dream of them undermining Moscow. I think it'll do the exact opposite. I think it'll just galvanize the resolve of the Russian people more so, and untie the Russian government's hands further to do whatever they need to do to really end this the way they need to. A lot of people say, why didn't Russia mobilize sooner? I think it was because they realized that at the very beginning, if they did that, even though they needed more troops, they went into Ukraine, a country that is physically bigger, larger population, larger military, with fewer troops than the U.S. went into Iraq in 2003. So they needed more troops. They needed the mobilization, but in the beginning, politically, they couldn't. All the U.S. is doing now is allowing Russia to justify expanding this as they need to create an overwhelming amount of force on their side against NATO and their proxies.
Yeah, and I wanted to get your reaction, given that we've talked a lot about just kind of throwing arms at Ukraine. There was another story that broke by the New York Times very close to just before the Crimea sort of change of heart, maybe, that the United States is having strategically. And the report was that the United States, and you mentioned Syria more than a few times here, and we know that Israel has been a big part of the proxy war, the dirty war on Syria. Well, now the United States is pulling artillery and ammunition from Israel and sending it, now they say, to Poland and then to Ukraine, but really it's to give it to Ukraine. And it's considered these emergency stockpiles that they've placed in Israel with only U.S. access. They say that Israel can't access any of it unless Israel asks for emergency purposes. And then in the same report, it said that they did the same thing in South Korea. And they're doing the same thing, and it adds up to 150,000, 300,000 shells, something like that. What do you make of this story? Because I find this, we kind of have been hinting at this seems to be getting a little desperate. Like it seems you got to pull from everywhere. And I think the big theme here seems to be the U.S.'s stockpiles are lower than they wanted them to be. NATO's are incredibly low. And it seems like they're pulling from everywhere. What's your reaction when you hear that this is happening? And how should we understand this move? By the United States and NATO.
I saw someone actually do a super chat in the chat section talking about how the U.S. has hundreds of military bases around the world. They've got stockpiles of ammunition and weapons all around the world for all different kinds of contingencies, which is absolutely true. And the story that you're talking about, that is them raiding these stockpiles because they've run out of weapons and ammunition to send Ukraine. And the fact of the matter is, both the United States and Russia created a huge amount of weapons and ammunition for a potential conflict with each other during the Cold War. Russia, since then, how many wars have they been fighting versus how many wars has the U.S. been fighting? And then on top of that all, Russia continued preparing all of these decades for a large scale, intense war like what we're seeing right now. And the U.S. was scaling everything back to these small wars all around the world, pushing around developing nations. And so at the end of all of this, the U.S. has found itself extremely vulnerable in a conflict like this. The RAND Corporation's document from 2019 extending Russia talked about sending lethal aid to Ukraine to provoke and overstretch Russia and to make them pay a cost in blood and treasure in eastern Ukraine, the Donbas region. And they also warned that if Russia decides to escalate and actually go into Ukraine, even though that would extend them, but it might actually escalate things beyond what the U.S. and their allies are capable of handling. And I think that's where we find ourselves right now. And so you say desperation. I think, yes, it's desperate. If you're still trying to fight a proxy war with Syria and you have these stockpiles right next door in Israel and you're sending them to Ukraine, I mean, what does that say? What does that say about where the U.S. is right now?
Doesn't feel like a victorious or winning position as they continuously try to hype up and build all of this enthusiasm around unity and defending democracy. But it has felt like for quite some time that this conflict, and when you even hear things like, all right, we're not so worried about Russia attacking Ukraine with nuclear strikes. That, I mean, I remember when that was a huge point of conversation. It was right around, actually, I believe, these peace talks that were then leaked out as being disrupted. But it was right around, I feel like it was right in this April period, May period. And there's all these talks about, well, Russia could use tactical nuclear weapons. And it went through all the tabloid Western media and went through the entire Western corporate media apparatus. And it's almost like now they're admitting that they were just not telling the truth in the first place, because now they want to do something different. Now they want to step up and escalate, and so they need to kind of roll back the narrative. I feel like that's been a common theme here.
Yeah, well, they do. They paint themselves into the corner with their narratives, and then they just walk across the wet paint, and they don't care. And because they've done this so much, I think it has undermined their credibility, even among Western audiences that aren't really awake. I think this, just the fact that they continuously do this is starting to alert even people who are not really paying attention. I mean, they were accusing Russia of talking about using nuclear weapons when Russia did nothing of the sort. And just like you say, now that they want to dismiss any possibility of a nuclear escalation because they want to flood all of these weapons into Ukraine, now they pretend like it's not an issue. How do they know it's not an issue? They claimed that Putin was talking about nuclear weapons. When did he stop talking about them? When did he go back on this position that he never actually really had? But the New York Times never explains that. But this is what they do. They change with the wind. They did this all during Syria, and now they're doing it during Ukraine. And I think it's extremely dangerous, because I don't think they know which direction they actually need to go at this point.
Yeah, and I've been following your videos, and I've been reading some of the same articles in the Western media, and even Russian media now is saying, I haven't heard this necessarily from Vladimir Putin or Sergei Lavrov, but in certain you can read analyses in RT and other places saying that 2023 is a decisive year for this conflict. And the Western mainstream media says this quite a lot. Actually, it's something that many Pentagon officials, the Biden administration, they're also saying. Stoltenberg is saying. They're all saying it kind of in line. What exactly is decisive about this year, do you think? Is this a tacit admission that there's going to be a conclusion to this within the year? Or is this something else that we should be thinking about? What do you think about this narrative of this being a decisive year for this conflict?
I think it's kind of projection, actually. I think in the halls of Western power, it's a decisive year because they need to make a decision. And whatever their decision is, it's either going to escalate this into uncharted territory, or it's going to end in their defeat. That is the decision that they are faced with. Sending all of these weapons is not going to change anything on the battlefield. The only thing that could potentially change anything is if they intervened directly, and it could manifest in many different ways. I have warned since this began that the West would be very tempted to create a buffer zone in Western Ukraine, possibly even including Odessa on the coast, to make sure that whatever is left of Ukraine at the end of all of this still has access to the sea. But it could be even more than that. We don't know. We don't know what that's what they have to decide. That's what makes 2023 decisive, because otherwise they could probably keep an armed conflict going for quite a while. But you're going to watch the Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian society continuously deteriorate throughout this. So it'll become increasingly obvious that there is no light at the end of the tunnel for them. They are done. They're just fighting on, just like the militants in Syria. They continue fighting on. There's zero chance of them overthrowing the Syrian government at this point. But this is what the U.S. wants. They want to prolong it for as long as possible. If they cannot win, they want to try to just burn everything down in the process. And I think they're going to have a similar approach regarding Ukraine. And I think, yes, decisive, because they have to decide. Do Do they want to intervene? How will they intervene? And if not, how are they going to deal with defeat?
Yeah, and at the same time that this is happening, at the same time that there's all these calculations, whether it's the weapons, how much do we send, when do we send them, how do we get them operable as soon as possible, or operational as soon as possible, as there's this seeming anxiety and projection, as you say, coming from the collective West, from NATO, from the US. At the same time, what I noticed, what I thought was kind of stunning, actually, was it almost seemed like you had a significant section of the foreign policy establishment in the United States in particular shifting their attention pretty intensely to Taiwan and China in a way that it wasn't necessarily coordinated, but it almost felt like there was some kind of almost shift in direction. There was maybe it was an order from high up or something that got all of these, especially the think tanks. But you even had James Bierman, a top general in Japan, do an interview for the Financial Times and say, we're setting the theater for war with China in Asia. Everything we've been doing, especially our increased relations and our ability to coordinate militarily with a now highly militarized Japan, given its doubling of its military budget this year. You had that. You had this Center for Strategic International Studies, a U.S. government weapons contractor funded think tank, do a war simulation around this. This is all happening from January 3rd to a week or two afterward. And then you had also Foreign Policy Magazine, of course, one of the top magazines of the neocon imperial establishment. They had David Petraeus. They had Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the former NATO Secretary General. You had all these war criminals come together and say, here's the lessons we need to learn from Ukraine in order to wage war on Taiwan, or wage war with China over Taiwan. And so, I guess I'm wondering what your reaction to this is, given all the circumstances that you've just laid out with Ukraine, that the situation is not necessarily going exactly in the favor of NATO, the collective West, and of course their master, the United States.
I mean, they're talking about learning lessons from Ukraine so that they can better wage war against China through Taiwan, because Taiwan is their proxy of choice. And Japan is playing the part of maybe Poland and Germany combined. And really what they should be doing is learning the lessons of why they should not even be thinking about doing this in Asia, what they're doing in Eastern Europe. But they're not going to learn that lesson because they have been obsessed for generations with subordinating China. They had at one point been in the process of subordinating China. People just look back to the century of humiliation that China went through. And they are obsessed with the idea of reasserting themselves over China and Asia. The idea of American primacy over Asia, which, I mean, it is a region of the planet the U.S. is not even located in, and yet they presume primacy over it. And so this concept is not easy for them to let go. They cannot let it go, just like they cannot let go the idea of allowing Russia to be a strong nation with an independent foreign policy, just like they can't let go of the idea of Germany having its own independent foreign policy and working together with Russia, but also still working together with the United States. They find all of this incredibly unacceptable. So as long as they find that unacceptable and they cannot imagine a world where the U.S. is among other nations rather than imposing itself upon all other nations, they're going to go down the same exact track. They're going to do the exact same thing in Asia that they've just done in Ukraine, and they're going to find themselves painted into the same corner. And Japan is going to suffer tremendously. They're already have all kinds of problems, domestic problems that they need to be addressing, and instead their government. Well, just think about it. Before the special military operation, it really looked like Germany and Russia working together with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, all of the trade, all of the energy, everything. It seemed impossible for Germany to have done the things that it has now done. But this is what the US does. They maneuver client regimes into power that are going to make decisions that suit the United States at the expense of the people in that actual country that the client regime is operating in. And so they're going to do the exact same thing in Japan. Japan's largest trade partner is China. The largest trade partner for everyone in Asia is China, more or less, with very few exceptions. And so Japan, trying to confront its largest trade partner, they're going to create a self-inflicted wound that they're not going to recover from, just like Germany isn't. Germany is cutting off Russia. They're being, I don't know how unwillingly they're being strong-armed into going along with the proxy war in Ukraine, but they are. And their industry is going to be gutted, and then they're not going to recover from it. And it didn't have to be that way. And the same goes for Japan. And so we just have to wait and see. Hopefully things... I mean, the reason they're talking about this, Danny, you're pointing out how ridiculous it is that they're in the middle of this complete disaster in Ukraine, and they're talking about picking a fight with China at the exact same time. It's insane, but the reason they're doing it is because they are completely out of time. There is no time for them to finish Ukraine and then move on to China. The window of opportunity for the U.S. to assert itself globally, in their mind, that is closing. I think it already has closed, but they see it as closing. They still have an opportunity where they could try something. So they're going to do it, whether it seems plausible or not. They feel like at least give it a try. And so that's where we are right now. Very dangerous times.
It is very dangerous, and it's absurdly dangerous, as you note. This article, I believe, in the Foreign Policy magazine was written. It was either January 3rd or published January 3rd or January 5th. I mean, of course, we've had solidarity. We had some things change in the Ukraine conflict scenario. But if you read this article, what's striking is the amount of just heavy, layered propaganda, war propaganda, telling us that Russia actually has done very poorly here. They were the ones who overestimated. So much projection, I think. They were the ones who overestimated. There are so many lessons that we can learn positively. So that's what's very ironic about this too, that they are saying that the Ukraine situation is a positive development that allows them to glean positive lessons for the next war. And what's so striking about that is that after all these things we talked about with Ukraine's problems, using this weaponry, being struck down, having to replace them very quickly, depleting stockpiles. In Taiwan, I believe there is kind of you have to serve in the military. You have to serve in what military exists there. I think for something like a month, right? Everyone has to do for something like a month. All military age demographics have to do that for a month. Taiwan, if we think that Ukraine is having issues with the military side of this, being able to handle these weapons, Taiwan is awash. They call it making it a porcupine. That's what the foreign policy establishment says. They haven't used any of these things in any real combat situation, nor do I think most people on that island would ever really think such a thing was a good idea. So it just seems to me so absurd to look at Taiwan as this panacea for the next war, when the situation seems more dire there in terms of prospects than even what's happening in Ukraine.
You're absolutely right. And there was a local election not that long ago, and the Democratic Progressive Party fared very badly. And that was because, Tsai Ing-wen, the current president of Taiwan, she even said it was it was like a referendum on all of her rhetoric about Taiwan being independent, being anti-mainland, being anti the rest of China because they are part of China. And even she recognized it. And so that is the mood in Taiwan versus, the mood in Ukraine, where you have at least a significant part of the segment of the population that is extremely anti-Russian and extremist. Right. and militant. You don't have this demographic in Taiwan. Also, Taiwan, I don't know if people know this, it's an island, so you're not going to be shipping weapons into Taiwan in the middle of any possible conflict. But the thing that worries me is that we already see the U.S. moving chip production out of Taiwan, or at least trying to get the most valuable parts of that, put it in Arizona. Whether it's going to work or not, I doubt it. But that's what they're doing. And why would you be doing that? If your idea is to protect Taiwan and then make it independent, give it this bright future, why would you be doing that? What they're actually doing is preparing to blow the whole thing up. They want to create the biggest, nastiest, most costly conflict possible for China, to just set China back, whether they win or lose. I mean, they know they're going to lose, but they just want to try to create as catastrophic a wound geopolitically for China as possible, to force it to lose face on the global stage, depict it as aggressive, as violent, as much death and destruction. The same process that they're going through with Ukraine, and smearing and undermining Russia's position on the global stage. And so this is where they are right now. It's you're doing scorched earth as you retreat. So that the American empire is retreating, and they're resorting to scorched earth, and they're just destroying everything. So I think everything from Crimea to Taiwan and everything in between is at risk because of this dangerous mentality. And I think, unfortunately, there are a lot of world leaders and governments that are well aware of this and are trying to get ahead of it. And I think there's others who, unfortunately, are ill-informed, and they go along with whatever the Western media says, and they're unprepared for it.
Yeah, in my estimation, too, when we see the strategy, when we see the U.S.'s geopolitical ambitions, imperial ambitions seem to falter, and yet we hear the cacophony and the rhetoric intensify, I think there's both, of course, maybe anxiety producing more intense escalations, but also the fact that if you just look at any of these sources that are promoting this, that are pushing this, we see that there are big economic players, especially the military contractors, that are bankrolling much of the strategic arm, the theoretical arm of the U.S.'s military plans and goals, whether through these think tanks. The New York Times can't stop citing think tanks like the Center for Strategic International Studies, and in this foreign policy article, that's all you really got. You got a bunch of either former war criminals like David Petraeus, or current war criminals, David Petraeus, or you have these fellows from places like the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Literally the biggest funders are Northrop Grumman and the biggest military contractors. So obviously a lot of this also is to generate and fuel the arms industry and to give them what they want. But maybe now is a good time to get into some questions to close the program. And I'll try to ask as many before you are completely exhausted. So we have a few. We don't have too many at the moment, but for those who have any kind of questions, you can leave a super chat, sign up on YouTube, or sign up on Patreon. But one of the ones that I saw early, let me just pull it up here. They say, what is the possibility of NATO or Western forces occupying some part of Ukraine? Yamlak, thanks for the super chat. What do you think, Brian?
In my estimation, this is something that I've been warning about since this began. I could very easily see them attempt to establish some sort of buffer zone in Western Ukraine, including Odessa, so they maintain access to the sea. I could easily see them do that and then try to expand from there. If you took over Western Ukraine, NATO forces were in Western Ukraine, it would create a sort of no-fly zone, no-go zone, just like in Syria. Eastern Syria is kind of a no-go zone for Russia and their proxies. So they would try to create something similar. And then that would reduce, because right now, every time something that Ukraine is using breaks down, say in Bakhmut, they have to send it 1,000 kilometers to the border with Poland to get it repaired, and then 1,000 kilometers back. Now, the real question is, if they tried to set up some kind of buffer zone in Ukraine, and what happens if Russia fires cruise missiles into that buffer zone to destroy maintenance facilities and other things they try to do to shorten the logistic lines? I don't know. That's scary. It's a scary prospect.
Sure. Yeah. Well, we have another question here. Thank you, Matless X. Can you explain, Brian, the reasons why Russia would have ordered the French ministerial vessels that ended up sanctioned when it seems that Russia's military complex could have produced these items? I'm not sure about that one. What is your take, Brian?
I mean, obviously, with effort, Russia could produce their own amphibious assault ships. They can, but it's part. France already has a deal like this could help cement a relationship between Russia and France, and thus the rest of Europe, just like they were doing with Nord Stream 2. This was all about, I mean, it was always on Russia's side. It was always good faith. They were always doing deals with Europe that they didn't actually really need to do. I think, as this viewer is pointing out, they didn't really need to do this, because now that this program was canceled, Russia is developing their own amphibious assault ships. So, I mean, this was always about trying to create connections between Russia and Europe to make sure that conflict was never a prospect. And the U.S. thoroughly sabotaged it, and all of the proxies the U.S. has helped maneuver into power in the capitals across Europe and in the European Union in Brussels, they have ensured that this did not happen. And who is paying the price for it? It's Russia to a certain degree, but mostly Europe now is paying the price in terms of energy and in terms of all of these deals that are now gone.
Yeah. All right. So we have Lance. Thank you, Lance. Do you believe the United States will send Abrams M1A1 tanks to Ukraine?
It's hard to, I mean, I'm just guessing, but I think they're probably going to. I think they're going to send everything that they have. Germany's going to eventually send Leopards. And look, if they don't, and there really is this real rift in Europe, then that is the end for the U.S. and its proxy war. But I don't think so. I think this is just theatrics. I think they're eventually going to send the Leopard 2s, and then once they're all gone, the U.S. is going to say, "Well, we have Abrams," and they're going to send those, and it's gonna be a disaster. And you're going to see all of these Western main battle tanks burning in Ukraine. And you're going to see a Leopard 2 tank in the Russian museum next to a Nazi Tiger tank. And Germany, the government, is going to deserve to bear that shame for generations to come.
All right. Well, this is the last super chat question. It's a little bit of a different one, and then I'll get to the Patreon question. The Angry Canuck says, Brian, would you be willing to debate Destiny? I don't know if you're familiar with Destiny. I'm only modestly familiar with Destiny, very, very little. But what's your take on this?
Yeah, I have two options regarding on what I do with my time. I could do research and analysis and help inform people, or I could become a sideshow or something, because that's what Destiny will end up doing if I debate him. So, I mean, to what end? If people look at my research and my analysis, it stands on its own. If you know, I just, you know, that's all I have to say about that. I've tried to debate. I've reached out to people and tried to debate them, and they always refuse to. And actually, I've not actually been able to debate anyone since I started doing videos.
No one wants to touch Brian Berletic. No one wants to touch the new Atlas.
And then after a while, I just decided that it is just better to do research and analysis, because these people will just waste my time and distract me.
Yeah. I mean, my take with people who do that kind of work, if we can call it work, they tend to create environments that don't allow for this information to be actually debated. It usually becomes like it's, you know, over this setting too, it becomes like an interrupting match, or something or other. And generally, unfortunately, the opposing side, it does whatever they can to usually move into bad faith territory, smears and things like that. It can be, yeah. I definitely have
and you'll end up that's all you'll end up doing is responding to it and dealing with harassment and all of these things. And like I said, I feel like it's just better to use my time to do research and analysis that could be useful to people. I understand that these debates can be entertaining. Very rarely can they be insightful. I feel like anyone in the chat that actually thinks it would be, I mean, I know it would be entertaining, but would it be insightful? I don't think so. I really don't.
So I wanted to ask you, so Phil from Patreon, longtime subscriber, thank you, Phil. And that's the best place to support this channel. So do subscribe. It's one of the things that you can do is submit questions to guests. Phil asks, and this is a bigger picture question. So Phil wants to know that, and it's up until this point, it seems like, the West has generally refused to provide the weaponry that Ukraine needs to win, right? It hasn't really been able to get back to 2022 levels, the beginning of this conflict, as you've mentioned, Brian. And Phil says this seems like it's conceding defeat to some extent. And do you feel like the collective West will pressure Zelensky to surrender at some point and stop the futility of fighting? Or will the Ukrainian people pressure him? And if so, will this be enough to force or allow him to stand up to the forces pressuring continuation? I mean, what's your take on this?
It's a really good question. I don't think there's anything the U.S. and its allies can provide Ukraine that will allow them to win. I mean, they had the best army that they were going to have at the end of February 2022. They had 1,000 tanks, and a lot of them were modernized, and they were formidable. They had almost 2,000 artillery pieces, and they knew how to use them. They had been using them. They knew how to use them. The problem is they had all of this equipment. They had an air force. The air force was rendered, was neutralized, more or less. They either lost anything they sent up, or they had to use them in very small numbers, very selectively. So essentially, they don't have an air force. And then on a modern battlefield, if you don't have an air force, you are at a huge disadvantage. And so there's what can the West send Ukraine that will help them win? I don't know what that would be. They've been sending them equipment. It's been being destroyed. Russia is still making advances on the battlefield, even now, after we were told the tide already turned. Now they need to turn the tide again. Will they try to get Zelensky to negotiate? No, they're going to try to push this and keep this going for as long as possible. As long as it's costing Russia, they're going to try to keep it going as long as possible. They couldn't care less what happened to Ukraine. That much is abundantly clear. They created this in the first place deliberately because they knew it would provoke Russia, and they knew it would be the destruction of Ukraine. They knew that, and they did it on purpose. Before 2014, they were talking about doing this. They did it, and now we see the result. So they don't care what happens to Ukraine. As much as they don't care about what happens to Russia there, but they're deeply invested in destroying Russia. Ukraine being destroyed is just a byproduct of this process. So I don't think that, and I don't think the Ukrainian people are going to rise up against Zelensky. I've talked about this on the Duran, I think it was recently. In war, you have soldiers, low-level, low-ranking soldiers. They have no idea what's going on. I mean, even I as a former U.S. Marine in just training, I had no idea what was going on. We got very little information from our superiors, and we're not allowed to go and talk to like a general or something. That's just unthinkable. So you are a hostage of the situation because you don't know what's going on, so you don't know what to do except what you're told. And that's your best chance at surviving, so you think. And so the idea of people across Ukraine in the middle of a war where it's like this for soldiers and I think civilians alike. You have the SBU, you have gangs of extremists, roving the country. You take a huge risk just protesting at all, let alone trying to rise up and do something. I think the best chance that Ukraine has is someone higher up in the military doing something, but I wouldn't count on that. I hope that answers the question. Did that answer the question? If not, if I missed a part of it, let me know, Dan.
No. I think that was thorough. That was thorough. I think the question had a lot of components to it, and you hit you hit them. Someone asked the question. I do want to acknowledge everyone who has been sending super chats. I am sticking to the questions now. But Lance asks, I think this is the second question from Lance. Do you see a tipping point in this conflict, a point where Ukraine's forces will collapse? Another good question.
Well, watching their performance around Bakhmut and Soledar would suggest that some sort of breaking point has been reached, whether it's Ukrainian forces in the Donbas region or if this is a nationwide problem. That remains to be seen. Ukrainian command could be pouring everything they have to spare into Bakhmut and Soledar, and it's just not making any difference. But there could be a reserve of forces that they're not willing to touch because they have that marked for something else. We don't know. And it's hard to draw conclusions unless you know the disposition of troops on both sides. Everywhere along the line of contact, it's very hard to make predictions unless you know that. And I don't think anyone, very few people have a good idea of that. And so I hesitate trying to predict anything. But I think there will be a tipping point. You can only sustain this for so long. A lot of people try to compare this. Russia is going to have another Afghanistan. Ukraine used to be part of Russia. They have a common language and traditions and customs and history. They have all of this in common. This is more akin to a civil war than it is an invasion of a foreign country. So I wouldn't count on the Vietnam or the Afghanistan phenomenon being a factor. And I think it's just a matter of time before it doesn't matter what the logistics are strained, the power grid is strained, everything starts. The pressure is just too much, and you start seeing things crack. Which we were kind of talking about that, whether or not Arestovich departing, and we don't know what the circumstances were, why the Minister of the Interior was in a helicopter and with this whole team. But I mean, these could be early signs of this, but we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree. It's a good question. So I want to get back to this question that Pamela asked that we did reference. It's a very generous super chat. But also I was wondering to kind of maybe add onto this question, because we talked about Israel and South Korea and how that's an example of this. And you talked about how this is definitely already happening. Do you see, I'm wondering about, given that the U.S. is stretched elsewhere, do you feel like that should, it's obviously a production issue, and that's New York Times says this, they can't produce enough for Ukraine. The military contractors that are, responsible for this, they can't. And so do you feel like this is going to be something that we're going to see a lot more in the future, and where? Because they don't want to touch Asia, right? Or what do you think?
It's hard to tell, because they kind of aren't they? I mean, if they're taking artillery shells that were part of their stockpiles in South Korea, I mean, the whole reason the U.S. is in South Korea is not because of North Korea; it's because of China. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Maybe they feel like that is something that they can spare, because I don't know if they're going to get into an artillery war with China. I think that's mostly going to play out at sea and in the air, and because they will use Taiwan as a proxy, and they're not going to be able to deliver artillery shells to Taiwan. So maybe this is something they feel like they can spare. But Danny, you're right. It is a production issue, and it is a conflict that they are not prepared for. And you're starting to see even Western analysts, I would say pro-Western analysts, people who kind of believe in the Western-led international order, so to speak, Even they are starting to come around and realize that this is a production issue. It's an industrial war. We're not prepared for it. And this is not something you could be in the middle of and find a solution to in the middle of. It's something you could prepare for the next time it happens. But this time you are at the clear disadvantage. You're always going to be a step behind. So how do you win in a situation like that? And a lot of people are asking, I mean, didn't they think about all of these things? The sanctions against Russia. I mean, maybe this is like 5D chess and I'm just not smart enough to figure it out, but it just seems like they thought that it was going to work, it was going to be enough, and it obviously wasn't.
Yeah. Well, that does it for the questions. I actually was thinking about something I wanted to get your opinion on before we close out here that we didn't hit on. And I know this isn't the topic of a lot of your videos, but I'm wondering what you have thought about because you mentioned the sanctions, and of course we've both covered that these sanctions have been against Russia, now the most sanctioned country in the world by the US and EU, that these sanctions have backfired in many different ways. But now that there's this optimism, I think, about it that's creeping back into the Western media. You had Bloomberg report that, the winter's been warmer and actually the EU hasn't drained its supplies. Do you feel like, given that these sanctions haven't really worked, they didn't do the job, but do you feel like actually the US and the EU are in better shape than maybe people have been predicting for months? I think many people predicted that the energy situation would be even more dire than it is. But given that, I mean, you're in Thailand, so you have some maybe some insulation from the most direct consequences of this. But out in the West, it seems like there's still many big problems that have come out of this. But I'm wondering what your opinion is on the journey that these sanctions have taken over the course of this conflict.
I think a lot of people overstated the negative impact of the sanctions backfiring against the West. I think they overstated it, but maybe they overstated it in the sense that they thought it would be more dramatic. I think it's going to be more of a long burn that they're not ever going to get out of. And it is, because you're not going to find energy cheaper than what you were getting from Russia, period. So this is always going to be a problem that you're going to have to deal with, that others don't have to deal with, won't deal with, and will outcompete you from now on, economically, industrially. And as we can see, a lot comes down to industry more than just your economy. Wars are determined by industry. So, I mean, this is a huge problem that they've created for themselves that never had to be, but here they are. For Russia, again, this is something like, I thought that they would be smarter than this. They said that Russia was just a giant gas station, but they knew that it wasn't. I always assumed that, because surely even if you just read Wikipedia, you realize there's much more to Russia's economy than just exporting energy. So it's hard to believe, but sometimes when you hear these people talk at these think tanks, and they keep repeating these things, even when the public really isn't listening, you start to wonder whether they really believe that, somehow the US GDP is just so much bigger than Russia. They never thought about why it is. And that's in terms of industry, it really isn't the mismatch that the US and the EU thought it was, and that the Russians have an advantage in terms of industry. And the way that their society is structured versus the U.S. and Europe, especially the military-industrial complex. Everything in the West is done for profits. The Russian military-industrial complex wants to make profits, but they will make weapons to ensure that Russia has what it needs, even if there is no profit in it. And I remember reading, it was Novoya Gazeta, and they were talking about Russian production. They're like, they could only make 850 tanks a year. It's like, that is many times more tanks than the US and say Germany could make. So I don't know why that is such a small number. But they were also talking about how little profit the Russian military-industrial complex makes, and that is the whole point. Because it's purpose-driven, it's not profit-driven. You're profit-driven, you're making huge amounts of money, even though you're losing the war in Ukraine, the proxy war in Ukraine. Russia is not creating this industry to just make profit. This also has a purpose, and it's serving that purpose right now. So I go back and forth to thinking, is there something that I'm missing, or are these people really just this disconnected from reality? And I try not to underestimate the leadership in the West. So I try to assume the worst, but we just see more and more examples of them just being disconnected from reality.
Yeah, I've been reading Russian media too, in how now there seems to be some reflection on how this conflict has transformed. And exactly as you say, like when you have top officials and these thinkers and these thought leaders in Russia saying, yeah, this is turning from a military operation to a great patriotic war, the more that it escalates. When you hear those words, which have, of course, significance and harken back to World War II, you think that, well, yeah, Russia's military, whether it's private or whether it's the public, regardless of who owns it, that the Russian government, if they're saying it's a great patriotic war, then it's going to be fought toward those ends. While you have military contractors like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, they don't care about winning or losing. They're big monopolies, and they're not regulated by anything except the money that the federal government, that Biden is pumping into them, or whoever it is, when over the years. So it's a fundamentally different situation, and that's why you even have. I've been very interested in this Wagner group, because we know that the United States they are playing, and they've played a really atrocious role in places like Iraq, right? Like Academy, formerly Blackwater, these military contractors that do the fighting part, like they not just the weapons production, but the fighting on the ground. And so the Wagner group has definitely struck people's interest, because you have a lot of people in the US and the West being like, oh, if they have any anti-war sentiments, they're like, oh, that's kind of weird that Russia uses private contractor like Wagner. But yeah, Wagner, it seems to be doing what the Russian government wants them to do, which is to secure as much of Donbass as possible, and to protect and to do what they said they were going to do, demilitarize Ukraine. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, because I know we're getting to the close here.
No, that's okay. I just want to repeat what I've said often about Afghanistan. I used to read it was like an inspector general report. I don't think it was annual, but maybe it was. I don't know. But I read quite a few of them. And what they were doing was trying to look through all the expenses that were adding up in regards to this nation building the U.S. was trying to do in Afghanistan, the invasion, the occupation, and the supposed nation building. When you read through all the programs, you think, if these programs actually are doing what they are supposed to do, this is going to be the 51st state of the United States. I mean, they're rebuilding all of the institutions from the ground up, from the grassroots all the way up to the capital and the central government, and back down again. But in reality, what was happening was, because they are for-profit contractors, they come in, they do these projects, they do the absolute bare minimum to meet the requirements, to get their money, and then they go home to spend it. They couldn't care less what the outcome of that project was. And if it fails, even better, because then they could come back and do it again and make more money. And this is, I believe this is one of the contributing factors for why Afghanistan was a failure. It was because of greed. They were so greedy, and they got in the way of their own victory. And I think something very similar is probably beginning to develop in terms of Ukraine, because they're like, well, we're not going to win, but at least we can make money. I mean, Canada just sent 200 glorified SUVs that they're calling armored personnel carriers. I don't know. I have to look into that and see if they really pass as APCs, but I don't think so. But someone's going to get money for that. This money is not going to Ukraine. It's going to these companies, and it's the same with Afghanistan. It's over $1 trillion. It didn't disappear into a black hole. It went into these companies, and these companies aren't reinvesting it into some greater purpose. They're just whatever it is that they spend this money on. So it's they're a victim of themselves. Their whole system, it's structural, and I don't. There's no way for you to change that in the middle of a conflict. Sometimes you could try for years to reform a system like this, and it still doesn't work. But most definitely, they're not going to be able to change it in the middle of an ongoing conflict. Afghanistan lasted almost 2 decades, and it ended because of that reason, because they were never able to resolve that problem.
All right. So everyone, this was a great conversation. Thank you again, Brian. Before I kick it back to you, I just want to direct viewers to some information. So first, of course, keep, as you leave here, like the stream, hit the subscribe button, hit that notifications bell so you can know when I'm live, at least as best to the possibility that YouTube will allow. So with that said, of course, you want to be going to the links in the description. Go to my link tree. You can find my Telegram there. And more importantly, I'm trying to build up a newsletter so I can save emails of those who loyally follow my work. I do have a Substack. It is in the description. There you can sign up for free or for an annual. It tends to be, I think, one of the more popular to support people on because it's one of the better platforms. So you can also subscribe annually. But if you subscribe for free, I'm always updating when I am going live. And should enough people start subscribing, I may do some other things on Substack to ensure that you're getting other content as well. But with that said, of course, the best place to support this work financially, if you are able, is Patreon. You can find that link in the description. And then, of course, you can find all of the other options there also. But Brian, this has been, of course, a really good conversation as always. Thanks for being such a good friend of this program. Do you have anything you would like to share before we head out?
Well, thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure. And if people want to follow my work, it's the New Atlas. Just find me on YouTube, and then in the video description or all of the links to find and follow my work. And I have a video prepared, so I will be publishing that as soon as I'm done here. And it'll be about the latest U.S. Department of Defense military aid package. I go through it line by line. In case anyone's interested.
Yes, no, we'll all have to catch that one. Thanks so much for your work, Brian, and we will be back in touch soon. And be sure to do what you can to follow this channel, and you'll know when I am back. All right, everyone, take care and have a good rest of your day, evening, afternoon, wherever you are. Bye-bye.